In this video, I want to introduce you to the range of selection tools that are available to you. Selections are a very, very important part of Photoshop. In order to be a really successful Photoshop user, you want to get pretty good with selections. And it doesn't happen overnight. It takes some practice. But the good news is that Photoshop is constantly improving and adding wonderful little tricks to selection tools. Well, first of all, what is a selection tool and why do we make selections? Well, selections are one of the basics of Photoshop. We select an area in order to make changes to it. That is, we select it out, we can make changes to that area and not to other areas. We do this with adjusting contrast and saturation, but also when we get into compositing. I'm just going to go ahead and jump in and show you some of these selection tools and how they work. And I want you to practice with them this unit. In the next unit, we're going to add on a lot of other layers, and it'll get very exciting. Now, before I get started with showing you the selection tools, I want to make a copy of this layer. I'm going to work on this mockingbird, and right now we're in layers, and we just have the one layer here, the background. And in order to make sure that everything that I do doesn't permanently damage the image, well, I shouldn't say damage, change the image, I'm going to make a copy. There's a bunch of different ways to do this, and this is true of Photoshop. It's going to drive you crazy. I'll usually show you a couple, and then the next time I'll show you a couple more. The most basic, slow way to do this is to just go up to Layer and just do Duplicate Layer. And that's going to ask you, oh, do I want to duplicate this layer? Right now it's called a background copy. I'm going to go ahead and call it Mockingbird and click OK. And you can see that it's just put that layer up on top. The background is still locked, and both of them are visible now. We're actually going to turn one of them off. I'll show you another way to duplicate that layer on the next file. Okay, so let's start playing with this. Let's just mention this visibility for a second. I turned this off so it's not visible. It doesn't change the way anything looks because I've got this layer on top, but it does mean that when we start making changes, we won't see or manipulate this layer at all. Okay, so let's talk selections. There are three areas of selection tools. And the first one is just geometric. We're just going to start with the rectangular marquee tool so I can show you some basic things about all selection tools. Now, one of the things I think I mentioned last week, but it always bears mentioning again, is that every time we go to a different tool on the toolbar, you can see that happening up at the top, you get different options. So we're going to go to the rectangular marquee tool, and we have a certain set of options up here that I'm going to tell you about in a second. You also get this flyout, and these are totally handy to actually click on and get additional advice besides mine. It'll click off once we start using it. So with the rectangular marquee tool, I'm just going to drag, and notice that as long as I'm holding down the key and dragging, this will keep expanding, or I can make it smaller or bigger. As soon as I let go, it's set in place. And you have a selection because you have what are called marching ants around your selection. This is the way Photoshop tells you that you have something selected. It's important to notice that because sometimes you'll be trying to do something, and if you have something selected, you cannot do anything on anything except the selection. And I'll show you how that works in a second. So if you have this selected, I'm just going to go up to Adjustments. We'll just use the Brightness Contrast panel to show you the basics. You can see that anything that's in that selection is affected. Anything outside of it is not. It's essentially protected. Okay, I'm going to cancel out of that though. I don't want to use that yet. Now, I want to show you another thing about these selection tools, which is really important. And that is this little doohickey up here. I call it a doohickey. Sorry, that's very, very technical. So we have all these different choices. We have New Selection, and notice it'll pop out. This will say Add to Selection, Subtract from Selection, and Intersect with Selection. The intersect we use a lot in graphic design, not so much in Photoshop. So let's actually get out of here I'm going to deselect, which is Command D or Control D on a PC, and I want to show you how these work. So if I have it on New Selection, and I make a square, and then I make another square, the first square goes away. I'm going to deselect. If I go to Add to Selection, I make a square, and then when I make another square, it adds to that original selection. I can make a third square, and it's going to add to that again. And if I make an adjustment, it's going to affect all three of that whole area, that whole intersected area. Okay. I'm going to deselect and Command Z, go out of there. Command Z, by the way, that wonderful thing that will just take you back a step. Now, if I go to less than, this minus, and I make a big square selection, and I make a second one, it's going to subtract that corner out, which is very cool. Now the last one is intersect. I'll show you how it works, but it's unlikely that you're going to use it soon. And remember, these options come up on every selection tool. They're easier to see on this rectangular tool, so that's why I'm showing them to you here. So I have this, and then if I do a second selection, it's only going to save the place where they overlap. And again, very handy in applications in graphic design, not something that we use so much in photos. Okay, Command D. Also in this area is the elliptical marquee tool. And again, you notice that you can make this oval or circular. You can move it around. As long as you hold on to it, it's going to let you keep changing it. As soon as you let go, that's the fixed point. Okay. There are some interesting tools here that I'm not sure I'll show you in this course. The single row and the single column. These can be really handy, but they're more for advanced features. Now, the next are the freehand tools. The lasso tool, the polygonal lasso tool, and the magnetic. And these all operate very differently. The lasso tool, I like to think of it as basically my pencil. So let's go ahead and zoom in. One of the mistakes that beginners make is they forget to zoom in. You can do much better, more precise work when you zoom in to where you're working. So the lasso tool is just like drawing onto your image. You can draw in any direction you want. I could try to go with the image, but it's not actually paying any attention to my image at all. So once we get to the beginning, it's going to make that selection. So now I have this kind of free-form image. And I'll go ahead and pull up that brightness and contrast again. And you can see it's going to affect that image. Now, while we're here, I like to just add things on. I want to show you two things. One, I could actually invert this image. So if I go up to select, I could invert, and I'll zoom out, Command 0, and you'll see that the marching ants are now on the outer edge of the image. And that means when I go to my adjustments and I do brightness and contrast, it's going to actually apply that to the area outside of that selection. Very, very useful. Now the other thing I want to show you while I'm here, we'll zoom in again, is select, modify, and there's all sorts of stuff here, but for right now I'm just going to show you feather. This is one you're going to use a lot. And I'm going to go ahead and do it 50 pixels depth. Okay, and I'm going to click OK. And you notice immediately that shape changed a little bit, and that has to do with the feathering. But the feathering really shows up once you make your adjustment. If I feathered it, notice that it actually feathers that selection so that the change is very gradual. Again, you can imagine this is incredibly helpful. Okay, let's look at a couple of other areas from the freehand tool. So the polygonal lasso tool, this is great for architecture. So I'm actually going to go down to the bottom. Now, by the way, what I'm doing is I'm holding the shift key so that I've got the hand tool so that I can just use the hand tool to move around. You can also grab the hand tool over here. And I'm just going to go down to this more architectural part. And the way this works, it can be a little squirrely, my favorite term for a lot of tools in Photoshop. but you click a point and then you drag, and I can go all the way down to the bottom, and you click again and you drag it. Every time you click, you're basically taking a sharp turn. All of the lines in the polygonal tool are going to be straight. And here's the trick, the most important part. Notice we're not selected yet. And if you don't want to stop, if you want to stop and you don't connect it, crazy things are going to happen. We don't want that. So if you want to complete your selection, you just double click at the beginning and you have it selected. Now, if you get yourself in a bind and you can't seem to find your way back to that beginning point, let me show you a little trick. And this works in a lot of areas of Photoshop. So let's say I click, I drag, I click, I drag, I click, I drag, and then I forget, and I want out, and I can't get out. I just keep going, and I can't remember where I started. And okay, well, there is another solution, and that is the escape key. And that will just take you out of that tool. And that will solve things for you in many cases. Okay, one last tool here, and I'm going to move back up to the bird using that hand drag tool. This is the magnetic lasso tool. This is a semi-automated Photoshop tool, and it works by recognizing the contrast in the edges of an object. So you can see it's just dragging right along, and I can move up. Oops, and this is the problem. It's dragging along this edge. Now, much like with the polygonal tool, if I let go now and I decide I want to stop, well, it won't let me stop. I can escape, but what I really need to do if I want to use this tool as a selection tool is I need to, just like with the polygonal tool, I'm going to need to finish it off. And you can click so that you can drag across areas with less contrast, come back to the beginning, and then you have your selection. You can invert this, you can feather it, you can do anything you want. That's true of all selections. Okay, deselect. Now, I want to go down to the third option. These are the magic tools, and they really are quite magic. One of these is a fairly old tool. We're going to start with that, the quick selection tool, which is right in the middle. So the quick selection tool is semi-magic in that it is automated. You start in the center of any clearly defined subject, and you can just show you a little bit more about this. It is a squirrely tool, but so cool. And you see how it's just selecting those edges. Now, the trick with the quick selection tool is you need to really pay attention to the size of your brush. The size and the hardness of your brush is up here, and you can change the size here and here. For getting into these smaller areas, notice how I am on additive, right? So we have those three options again. So I want to point out that I tend to just default. I make sure that I'm always on add to selection. And so that stays there, and when I move and pick up a new brush, I can just go into that smaller area. I can also sort of nudge my way up. Now, the mistakes that you'll make with the quick selection tool, here's one of the big ones, is you'll go outside of your area too much, and it'll start to just grab anything. So you need to stay really inside, keep the center of that selection tool inside, and just sort of nudge your way up to the edge. Now, if edges are very soft, the way this one is, it may not be able to select it well. All of these tools are really dependent on Photoshop being able to read the edges of objects. It doesn't know what you want to do, it just knows where the contrast is. And you can keep on going. Here's a very cool thing. I can go to subtract, and I can subtract areas as well. So it's pretty cool. But there is a slightly easier way to work. Okay, so this is nice because I actually have my bird selected. I want to just show you how nice this would be because I can actually change the brightness or the contrast of the bird. I can invert it and change the brightness or the contrast of the outside. But I'm going to show you that in a second because right now I want to deselect, and I want to show you two even more magical tools here. So this one is, actually we're going to start up here. We're going to go back to the quick selection tool. And up here, we're just going to do select subject. And this is Photoshop just guessing, and look what Photoshop did. All that work I did, and I could have just clicked select subject. As long as you have a nice, well-defined subject, it's going to do a pretty good job of just grabbing it automatically. That's a relatively new tool. Now notice it did grab some stuff down here, so sometimes you have to do a little cleanup, and we'll work on how to do that a little bit later. But it is a pretty cool tool. Now there's another one which is called the object selection tool. Let's deselect everything. And with the object selection tool, this is handy if you have more than one bird, say, in the scene. You don't want to select all the birds. You just want to select this bird. And this is actually another good solution. It's not going to select anything here. It's just going to select the bird. Pretty cool. Now there's yet another part of the object selection tool. Let's go back to that, deselect, and I want to zoom in. So I can use the object selection tool to select something other than the bird. The select subject is always going to select the biggest, most obvious subject in the scene, but if I just want to select his eye, I can just come very close, and I might have to try a little bit tighter. There we go, and it's just going to select his eye. So very, very handy. I could try the same thing. Now I haven't pre-tested this, so let's see what happens. But it should just select the beak. So really, really cool automated tools that are relatively new to Photoshop. In the olden days, we just had to do the lasso. Now the last tool here, which is called the magic selection tool, operates by picking up either color or luminosity. It doesn't really work on edges. It's mostly about color. It's called the magic selection tool, and in a lot of cases it isn't as magic as you'd hope. Now I want to show you what happens here, and then I'll take you to an image that's much better suited for this. So I just want to select the background, so I'm going to click on it, and it seems to be doing a pretty good job because it's grabbing most of the background, because the background is all green. And I just keep clicking to pick up more of the background, but notice what happens. A lot of the bird has been selected. And that's because, if we zoom in, we'll see that the light off of the grass is reflecting up into the bird, and there's actually an awful lot of green that matches the background here. So this is not necessarily the best tool for this scene. Let's go ahead and deselect. Probably object selection is going to be best. This is the kind of image that the magic selection tool is ideal for, magic wand tool, excuse me, and that is blue skies. And almost always, if you have a nice clear blue sky against a nice warm foreground, this is going to be absolutely amazing. You can see I just click it a few times, and you can see really beautiful selection of the sky, so that I could just make the sky brighter or darker. Nicely done.